Hey everyone, welcome back to iPolitics' signature podcast, No Talking Points. I'm your host, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Brian Storseth, our publisher here. Today we have another jam-packed show. There's no shortage of topics, and of course joined by an excellent group of guests. Aya Dufour, iPolitics Major Projects Reporter, Erin Morrison, Vice President at Texture Communications and a former Deputy Chief of Staff to the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, and Jonathan Kalles from McMillan Vantage, former Quebec advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Thank you all for joining us. Erin, we're going to start with admittedly your strong suit, kind of looking through the results and the fallout from last Sunday's leadership election. We have a new leader in Avi Lewis, someone who, seemed to be seen as the favorite going into the weekend, but also maybe potentially the most polarizing figure considering some of his comments around other provincial NDP parties. Curious, Erin, we've had some dust settle. Of course, we had the tragic passing of his father, Stephen Lewis, yesterday. Definitely a major, giant in social democratic politics, if not just Canadian politics at large. But what's your response on that? You had some time to digest the weekend's results.
Yeah. Thanks for your kind words about Stephen Lewis, Marco. I mean, let's all just start by saying our hearts go out to Avi Lewis. And I can't imagine how difficult it would be to go through the final days of a leadership campaign when I'm sure what he really wanted to be doing was just being with family. So my heart goes out to him. Tough few days for Avi Lewis and a huge loss to the party. I was on the ground in Winnipeg for the leadership convention, and really for Lewis and Team Avi, it sort of seemed like a bit of a roller coaster, like the highest high, winning with 56% of the vote on the first ballot, lots of support in the room, huge crowd, 2,000 plus people there cheering, and then sort of immediately a bit of a real world crash with both the Saskatchewan NDP leader Carla Beck and Alberta NDP leader Nenshi issuing statements basically saying, nope, we don't like it. I think that there is a lot of room in a big party for disagreement. That even is something that Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew pointed out at the time he spoke to media and said there's things we're going to disagree on. That's fine. There's room in a big and growing family for fights. That's fine. And I actually think that in many ways, the energy policies are not that dramatically different. Lewis has been very clear that it's not about shutting down any sort of oil and gas until there are other things to replace it, which we all know is a long game. However, Lewis has got to take this seriously. I heard him in an interview after the weekend calling this a ruffle with the Prairie NDP leaders, and he's just got to take it more seriously than that. Beck and Nenshi are doing exactly what they should be doing, which is fighting like hell for their provinces, fighting for jobs, fighting for the industry, fighting for the economic activity that the oil and gas industry creates in those two provinces. And they both stand a reasonable chance of being premier soon of their respective provinces. And Avi needs to be part of the solution. He needs to be part of the mission to make them Premier Beck and Premier Nenshi, not a problem. And there's no amount of a first ballot victory that gives him the right to step on what those two provinces are doing, keeping in mind to get where they've got, hundreds of thousands, and in the case of Nenshi, like millions of people essentially that need to vote for them to be premier. And the NDP leadership race, very happy that we had 100,000 members, 70,000 ballots cast. This is excellent. Lewis's numbers are excellent, but can't hold a candle to the kind of numbers that Beck and Nenshi are looking at.
I do wonder, Erin, and you would, I think we both know this, but you would know obviously better than I do, how much of this was on Nenshi and Beck, just like, we can't let this become an attack ad. Daniel Smith will say, any photo of Nenshi shaking Avi Lewis's hand will be an attack ad in Alberta. It will be used against Carla Beck in Saskatchewan, as we know. Like, how much of that is just not really, like, there's not really this deep rift. It's just, I can't have this be used against me in a provincial election, knowing that we could win. We have a very good chance of winning in both these cases.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Marco. That's absolutely true that both of them need to, it's as much defense as offense, you're saying, right? They need to protect themselves. And absolutely true. Scott Moe's caucus instantly put out statements attacking Beck for things Lewis has said in the past. So for sure, this is a shield, not a sword in most cases. And also, I know those folks on the prairies. I was a Prairie New Democrat myself before moving to Ontario, and they really do believe in the oil and gas industry. They really do believe in the jobs it creates. And so there is a true ideological root to what they're saying. And also, same as it ever was. When I was communications director to the Saskatchewan NDP, I remember teaming up with the Alberta NDP and getting ourselves down to Ottawa to go tell the leader at the time, can you stop, please? Can you stop saying mean things about pipelines? So this is not new for the NDP. This is the same old story. There's always going to be some daylight in between the Saskatchewan and Alberta NDP's policy on energy and the federal NDP policy on energy, probably the BC policy on energy as well. And that's okay. Some daylight is okay, as long as we're not actually hurting each other in terms of our growth and the ballot box.
And Jonathan, I'm curious to know, a lot of talk was about what NDP candidate would hurt the Liberals the most. I don't know. I heard that, maybe Avi could really hurt the party in big urban centers, in Vancouver, Victoria, maybe other pockets like, maybe Montreal, Toronto. But also at the same time, maybe he lacked some of the potentially broader appeal that maybe Heather McPherson could bring in, or maybe a Rob Ashton. Like, what's your read on it? Is this good or bad news? Not to overly simplify something, but for the Liberals.
I mean, right now, here today, Lewis doesn't have much name recognition across the country. The NDP probably shortly won't have a seat east of Manitoba. And so where they still have at the provincial level either power or possibility of power, they're fighting with amongst themselves, as Erin was referring to. So what's their growth potential right here and now? I think it's zero if the current world situation continues. If Donald Trump is still the headline every day, what he's going to do, I just don't see where there's going to be any bleed away from Mark Carney on the one hand, and to the Conservatives on the other, where you saw in definitely southwestern Ontario and other pockets across the country where workers, in many cases, union members, were moving to the Conservatives away from the NDP. And so that brings me to, what does Avi Lewis represent in terms of the brand of NDP he wants to lead with? It's the urban, very left, what will be called by Pierre Poilievre, I'm sure, is woke, but talking really much more to urban elites, university, academia, probably minority communities across the country, and much less so to working class, which is where the growth potential would be. But right now, that's not who he's talking to. It was the Rob Ashton base, which ultimately turned into very little support, finishing fourth, which I think was a bit of a surprise. But again, it's picking a couple percentage points here or there. Where is their base and where is right now their opportunity for growth in this Trump world? I don't really see it. And Mark Carney moving to the center, and in some cases center right, we've been saying now for a year, there's a lot of room on the center left for growth. I don't know that Avi Lewis will represent to voters the center left. I think he will represent the far left, and fighting with moderate NDP premiers or opposition leaders across the country is probably not a great recipe for growth.
And Brian, you're our resident Alberta whisperer. Although, Erin probably could challenge you a bit for that role, I know.
I can tell you that in Quebec right now, especially if Boularice leaves, but even if he stays, I think you're looking at an NDP at like 2-3%. I don't think there's a riding they would get their refunds back. I mean, I think it would be a complete wipeout, and considering where we were 15 years ago.
But Jonathan,
the NDP was, it's a big change.
Is that more motivated by just the fact that the new leader does not speak French? And that would have been the case whether Heather or Rob or someone else would have won.
It's definitely a problem. I tried to catch a few minutes of the French debate and I turned it off because it was painful and embarrassing. And I did a media hit right after the Liberal leadership debate last February that was in French. And I did criticize Mark Carney's French and say that he had to improve it. I think Quebecers appreciate an effort and they're not worried about your grammatical mistakes or stumbling a little bit here or there. But the effort has to be there. And right now, I don't know that Avi's really capable of... The effort will be there. I'm sure he'll try, but it's not going to come across very well. But I think it's more than the French. I think just the NDP brand, there's no one really to carry that torch. or talk to Quebec issues.
The Francophone journalists in the room on the weekend told me that Lewis's French was serviceable and improved, and I will take their word for it.
I agree.
I also, though, think that the NDP's rebuild doesn't go through Quebec. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to give up on any seats. I want the NDP to be competitive, particularly on the island in Montreal. But I really think that the next 40 seats come from BC, the Lower Mainland, the island, the far north, and Southwest Ontario. So I'm not sure that like working real hard to win Trois-Rivières is like at the top of the to-do list for Lewis right now.
Going into the last election, Erin, was that kind of the focal point, though, as you guys got kind of into the trenches? What seats can we save? Is it still, obviously BC was the provinces where you guys did the best in 2021? Is it still that was basically what we were trying to hold during the last election?
For sure. In an election where, the Mark Carney as a brand new prime minister and new Liberal leader was an absolute juggernaut. Canadians were, and I'm interested to hear from Brian on this also, but Canadians were just really polarized about, let's go with Poilievre or let's do everything we can to keep Poilievre out. They were terrified of Trump and tariffs and what that would do to our economy, not to mention our sovereignty. And so when it became clear that the NDP was really in a just try to save what you can position, not because they ran a bad campaign or because Canadians were mad at Jagmeet Singh. I don't think either of those things are true. I think they just were so polarized to either support or strategic vote to prevent Pierre Poilievre from becoming prime minister. The NDP just sort of fell through the cracks. And yeah, in that situation, absolutely. You go to your strength first. And the strength for the NDP for a while now has been BC, Lower Mainland, little bits in the interior, the island, the north, Southwest Ontario. There are others, like all due respect to NDP MPs and former MPs who come from great seats. But I think that's where the rebuild really would be concentrated.
And I want to get Brian and Aya on this because, Brian, as I was saying, the resident Alberta whisperer, does Avi Lewis's win make life easier for Mark Carney in terms of picking up seats in Alberta? We know his polling's improving. Is this a kiss from the god for Mark Carney's chances in Alberta?
I don't think that has a lot to do with the NDP, if I can be honest with you. So first of all, it was an impressive win. He got more first ballot votes. Avi Lewis got more first ballot votes than Jagmeet Singh did. Maybe more impressively, and Erin and Jonathan would know this well, he raised more than double the money of his nearest competitor. And anytime you're trying to rebuild a party, the NDP has quite a bit of debt. That ability to raise money is job one. It's great to talk about strategies, the seats, and everything else, but if you can't pay for the staff that are going to help you get there, you've got a big problem. And so I think his ability to raise money is going to help them. And Erin makes a really interesting point. Like, if there's some reality that sets into the NDP that says, like, we're not necessarily trying to compete in 350 some seats, and they're going to compete in certain areas that maybe the Conservatives aren't going to compete in as well, and the Bloc are going to do well in certain areas where the other parties are. It leaves the Liberals, yes, to be fighting across the country far more, but it also puts them more vulnerable in more flanks, I think, as the election goes on and as Avi Lewis is able to define himself. Jonathan said something. I sure hope Pierre doesn't start talking about how woke he is, because I would really prefer the Conservative leaders stop talking about the NDP and focus on the Liberals. So, I think it introduces a very interesting dynamic that too many armchair quarterbacks sit back and say, oh, this guy's not going to resonate with anybody. He may end up resonating with the right people to help put the Liberals on a defensive on a flank that the Conservatives and Bloc just aren't going to. And Jagmeet didn't last time.
Yeah. And I obviously, you are well versed in the kind of oil politics here. If you are, taking Avi at face value in terms of what he's talking about, I know Erin was saying, well, he's not necessarily saying we got to turn off the taps tomorrow when it comes to oil and gas, but that message, what do you make of how that will be received, obviously from the oil and gas perspective, but in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where, that is such an integral part of their economy?
Well, I actually don't see how this isn't setting up some kind of collision course. And I know there's some nuance in how people express their views, but my understanding is that Lewis doesn't want to see an expansion of oil and gas. And I think that really is not what the Alberta NDP's position is, right? Like, I think their vision includes some pipeline expansion, some LNG, and some of that economic growth. So I don't know how you can sort of go on without someone at least changing their position on this. And I imagine because of the balance of power that it's Lewis who will have to change their position. Maybe the federal party will have to change its approach. But this is also interesting to hear Jonathan talk about how a lot of this is about branding going forward and how there's some room to grow on the center left, which is probably where you would find that sentiment about stopping the expansion of oil and gas in Canada. And I don't know how you strike that balance between keeping what is politically interesting for you in terms of your positions on this issue and reconciling with the platforms of your provincial cousins. I don't know that there's ground there, but this is definitely where the federal NDP is going to be trying to strive towards.
No, I mean, that's a good point, right? And I think both, Jonathan and I are saying the same thing in that, or I guess Erin too, with that the growth of the NDP is not going to come from the federal NDP is not going to come from Alberta or Saskatchewan, at least in the immediate future. It's going to come from these places that need to win. And if you need to do that, is Avi maybe the best choice because he can motivate those people. And to Brian's point, raise a lot of money for the party. I don't know if anyone can compete with that. And if the road of resurgence comes through BC, does it really matter if he's picking fights with, I guess your point, Erin, too, being like, you can't necessarily pick fights with your friends. Like, is that going to hurt him though? If Nenshi or someone else really kind of gets in his face, if this goes beyond just a statement saying, sorry, Avi, we're not a fan.
I just have a question on that to the BC experts more than I am, but I saw definitely a more positive response from David Eby than you did from, your BC and from the Alberta and Saskatchewan counterparts. But BC is planning to move ahead with LNG. And Avi Lewis has said categorically he's against any expansion. So where does that, that's going to be a confrontation at some point as well.
He's not been tried.
I should point out, David Eby during the campaign for leadership was very careful not to endorse anybody. And you could see those tensions build as the campaign was going on. So definitely a collision course.
That's a great point. But Erin, I guess Nenshi Beck can be like, Avi, take a hike. Eby, it feels like he can't because he knows that there is a sizable base maybe that would like Avi's views, especially in certain pockets like Lower Mainland and Victoria. Is that a fair read of Eby's delicate dance?
Yeah, I think that's right. This is not particularly different for the NDP versus the Liberals. I think they both have sort of the same balance to try to strike here. In BC, the center and center left want to make sure that the coast is protected and also, like to heat their homes and have jobs, right? And it's much easier in Saskatchewan where it's very clear, in Alberta, and it's not a big deal in Ontario either. We have energy jobs here, to be sure, but we're not looking in Ontario to grow the number of energy jobs in the oil and gas industry. We're more focused at the moment on nuclear growth. So honestly, this is regional politics that I don't see as dramatically different from the NDP as it is for the Liberals. But the tension here is also about can Avi Lewis dial in the right spot on the left side of the spectrum? Can he find the place where he doesn't have to agree with every NDP leader across the country? Although it would be real nice for New Democrats if he didn't hurt Nenshi and Beck in their premier hunt. But can he pick that spot that's not too far left that it's going to turn off center left people? It's not too centrist that he's going to lose his base that put him where he is so far. And every leadership candidate dials in a little bit differently after they win. I think about people like Erin O'Toole, who ran quite far to the right as a leadership candidate, and then, picked a spot that was a little bit more center right as leader of the official opposition. I think that this is not highly unusual to sort of, you're talking to one audience when you're running as a leadership candidate. Now you may need to broaden your language. And as Jonathan rightly pointed out, a lot of it is just really about the accessibility of language. A lot of it is getting out of that, the U of T debate society, and instead just talking to regular working people. Brian, I see you laughing about Erin O'Toole. So I don't know. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you totally disagree on this.
I couldn't agree more. And listen, I for those that don't know, I chaired Peter MacKay's campaign and watched in disbelief as Erin tried to put himself as somewhat of a conservative from Alberta very successfully. But the point I would make, and the thing that I've learned that I think really agrees with what you're saying, people don't know who Avi Lewis is. Outside of the NDP base, nobody really knows who he is. And, we're going to make a lot to do about the money that's going to be spent on advertising, whatever, to help define him. But the reality is the next election is going to be when people are really introduced to him, and what he decides to take on as his issues will be what people's first impression of him in a lot of ways are. So it's an opportunity, but it's not one that everybody can successfully grab. And I think if the NDP are focused on rebuilding in select areas, it could be very successful. But because the Prime Minister doesn't seem to have to even attempt to appease that side of the base at this point in time with some of the things that he's had to do, right? So I think the next 6-8 months are going to be really interesting with the Liberals actually having to contend from both sides of the spectrum. And then on the other side, is Pierre able to sustain some kind of semblance of a reasonable, rational option on the right-hand side of the aisle as well? So it's going to be an interesting next 6 months.
And to differentiate himself, hey, Brian, like what's the difference in policy between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney right now? The big difference in personality, but what is Pierre Poilievre giving the right to be excited about?
Well, apparently he's opposed to the high-speed rail.
Did not have that on my 2026 bingo card. Poilievre says no to trains.
I know, that was so odd. I was like, there's so many other opportunities to speak up against this project in the last 6 months, and I have not heard a peep from the Conservatives about it. So like, why now? It's pretty random.
They actually they screwed up and voted against the funding, and then they actually switched their votes in committee because they had screwed up because they wanted the vote to pass. So they supported this, and they actually put funding for the next phase of the planning.
Yeah, and I remember that meeting, and the Bloc Québécois MP was going so hard in opposing the project, and the Conservatives just let him fight alone.
Exactly.
Help the Liberals along, and now they're all against it. It's a waste of money. No one's going to use it.
And Blanchet having a press conference this morning to blast it live in Terrebonne because he thinks that's his winning issue to put him over the top, which I think he's probably wrong.
Yeah, I think the Liberals are going to take Terrebonne. I'd put a fin on that.
It is interesting when we had a few Liberals on here, they were attacking McKinnon for his timeline not being aggressive enough on getting the high-speed train. So I don't know if they're feeling like the problem is we're moving too slowly, and the Bloc and the Conservatives are saying we oppose the project in general. I don't know who is a better read of the Canadian public in that case.
I thought it was Conservatives who thought the Liberals were moving too slowly, waiting for too many approvals, not just approve it and let it go through.
Well, Jonathan, maybe not for the same reasons, but finally we've got Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre on the same side of an issue. So there's that at least.
For now, for the day.
Yeah, that's the point. We'll see what tomorrow brings. I did my last comment actually want to get your thoughts on this, Jonathan, and I'm being very glib here. Is the Liberal leadership race the easiest one to contend with? Because I feel like the NDP, we have an example with Avi. Brian was talking about, Erin O'Toole. It's like, how do you say I'm the best position to win, but at the same time, I'm hard and true partisan. Whereas the Liberal race, I feel like it's all about electability. Mark Carney won with almost 90% of the vote. And his message was basically, I'm not going to do what Trudeau did. I'm going to walk back a huge section of those policies. Is that, again, I'm being glib here, but it's like everyone else is like the Liberals' mantra is just win, baby. That's the only thing that really matters when it comes to.
I mean, to a degree, but so that makes it, I wouldn't say easier, but because the party in general is not ideological, yes, it has that advantage. On the other hand, it means it gets attacked from the left and the right, and isn't always sort of sexy and motivating because you're the middle ground. And so how do you get your troops motivated? Is it just by come out and vote, or is it on specific issues? I think Mark Carney obviously was very different than Justin Trudeau's leadership. I do want to note, though, that while it's basically impossible to do proper polling for a leadership race because we don't know who's voting, they've been pretty accurate, these sort of internal polls, based on how much money people have raised. Mark Carney, much bigger margin than expected, but won easily. Same thing for Avi Lewis. I think we'll see that in the CAQ leadership race in a couple of weeks, where there was a poll today. Christine Frechette seems to be far ahead, but how do we know who really is voting? I think she's likely to win, and then we're going to start to say, wow, these sort of polling data based on money, fundraising seems to give us a pretty good indication. We haven't had many surprises recently.
No, that's a good point. I actually want to stay in Quebec, and Jonathan, I'll start with you. Dufour over the Air Canada CEO's unilingual message of condolence. Seems like we were maybe at an end of this controversy, and that Air Canada's announced his impending departure. I'm always so surprised with what issues kind of resonate, but the fact that the PM not only just said, I'm not, like, he went out of his way to comment on this and express, use as strong as language as possible that would come out of Mark Carney's mouth in the public setting. Like, what's your read, Jonathan, on how this issue was handled and how maybe sensitive it could be politically? Or do you think the PM kind of staved that off with his comments?
So I think in the short term, it will be quiet now until we find out who the next CEO is and we assess his or her language skills, because that will draw some attention. But this guy's been a lightning rod for 5-6 years. It's I think, to a degree specific to him. Air Canada also has had issues with its language. You now get on a plane and they tell you, we're proud to serve you in both official languages. That's because they've gotten slapped many times and fined many times, and they haven't taken that seriously, and that's their legal responsibility. But this guy, Rousseau, spoke at the Chamber of Commerce in Montreal about 5 years ago, spoke in only English. And when doing a media scrum after, like, that was bad. That was poor decision. At least throw in some lines. He can't speak French, fine. But when doing a scrum afterwards, basically with contempt, with a real arrogance, said, well, I've lived here for 14 years and I never spoke French. Why should anybody care? And that's where it went off the rails. And so now we have a guy who's a lightning rod who basically says, I don't care. And you now have a situation where a couple of his employees, pilots, one is French Quebecois, who dies, and he can't even feign to read a statement in French that would be broken, but at least the effort would be there. And he said he was going to take French courses. 5 years later, he says bonjour and merci. That's offensive. That's just bad crisis management, crisis communications. I think we can teach so many lessons of what not to do from Michael Rousseau. So I personally am happy that he's gone, and that this situation, we can move on to something else, because one of the specialties of the independence movement is being martyrs and being victims and pointing fingers and making mountains out of molehills. And this was a perfect example. And so I'm sure there'll be more, but let's move on from this one, is my attitude.
I'm glad you made that point, Jonathan. Aya and I were in the office and we were joking that maybe Rousseau is a psyop by the PQ and CAC as a way to justify their French language policies. Because he literally just said, how could you feel so English? I can do whatever I want. So, Aya, obviously you're better or worse than I am about this. Jonathan talked about this could be really good fodder for the nationalists, the sovereigntists. The fact that it's tapering out, is this still something that maybe the PQ, and I know the CAC is in a very weakened space, is this still something they can maybe use to rally the supporters in advance of the fall election?
I was very curious to see how this would get resolved, like the outcome. Because I remember when he made those comments at the Montreal Chamber of Commerce, in the aftermath, like I remember protests in front of Air Canada headquarters. And I just kept thinking, like, there's no way this guy is staying on. Like, there's going to be some kind of demotion or consequence. And then when things just continued, I was like, wow, okay. And then when the condolence message on social media came out, I was like, okay, then he can't survive this one. He's not this. So now a retirement, I'm like, okay, this is kind of the best outcome for everybody, because predictably, like in some, like, I guess the National Post, for example, ran some headlines along the lines of, why is this a big deal? Bilingualism, glass ceiling, with only 20% of the population who speaks it, so why should he have to speak it? And I'm like, okay, I was kind of expecting some parts of the population to not understand why this is important. But I was wondering, if he does get demoted or fired or, dismissed, is this going to, give them fuel to talk against bilingualism policies in federal institutions? So I was like, maybe that's not the best outcome for Quebec and French speaking communities in Canada, if that's, where this ends. Retirement is nice and tidy. Kind of implies that it's his own will, that he wants to go on to a next chapter and, can quickly replace it and not have too much of a frou-frou around it. So, interesting outcome. I think it does say a lot about the state of French in Canada and the policies that we've been seeing out of the CAC and the PQ about protecting the language and the importance of doing that. Whether those policies are working, I don't know, because I find the focus tends to be, newcomers are coming here and they're not learning French, whereas, it's more there are some power dynamics countrywide when it comes to French and who gets to speak it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
I was just going to say, I feel like we could have a whole podcast on why it's particularly bad that someone in a senior leadership position of a major company in Quebec was speaking English, and the power imbalance there, and the elite class there speaking English, while saying they don't have to learn French. But Erin, I want to kind of ask you, put on your PR hat a bit. How do you think Air Canada kind of navigated? Because I get Aya's point, look, it can inflame both sides of the political debate. You have, the more conservative crowd are going to try to say, look, they're roasting this poor man for not speaking French, even though, and then the other side, the Quebec conversation. But just, purely on how Air Canada handled this, do you think they did a good job to maybe shut down some of that criticism?
I think Air Canada over the past 5 years or so has done a horrific job on comms, just horrific. I mean, the reason really why this particular video from Russo, I think, was so offensive to people is not just that this is a Montreal-based company, but also that one of the pilots who lost his life trying to save all those passengers is a Quebecois man. The fact that you are sending condolences to his family and trying to memorialize him in a language that they don't even speak, it's just thoughtless and heartless. And we would have expected more effort from Air Canada CEO. I think Jonathan earlier said, it's not a big deal if your grammar's bad. It's not a big deal if your pronunciation's bad. I think most Quebecers are willing to forgive that. But what they're not willing to forgive is a dismissive, like, you're not even willing to try. The thing about this in particular, it reminded me a little bit of the Bev Oda $16 glass of orange juice, not to trivialize the video from Russo at all. It was like, how many times has Air Canada been in the news for treating people with disabilities like just horrifically badly over the last 5 years? This is now at least the second time that Russo has been taken to task on refusing to be respectful of the French language. We know he's not born in Quebec. We know he doesn't speak the language. Okay, we get it, but you got to try, right? How many times it had a real rocks in a backpack feeling. And I have to say, letting him retire, I'm totally hearing Aya's argument that like this was sort of a tidy way to just be like, clean break, it's a retirement, whatever. But I also found it so unsatisfying. He's messed up again and again and again. And it's sort of like he's getting off on a technicality. The record will show that you can be this bad to francophones. You can be this bad to people with disabilities. You can be this bad to your own employees, right? Not paying your flight attendants appropriately. And in the end, still enjoy your full retirement and pension and just get to choose your own exit. It felt a little bit unsatisfying to me. There's this lack of a sense of justice there.
Are we going to see him in committee? Because maybe that'll feel good.
Good point.
I was going to say, if there's a message from this, maybe it is that in certain sectors in the Canadian economy where there is little to no competition, having a CEO at one of those top jobs is the best job in the world to have. So if Bell or Rogers wants to appoint me as a CEO, I'm happy to take the money. Seems like I can do whatever I want and very little consequence. I'm putting my hand forward for that nomination. I did want to shift gears a bit. We had a big housing announcement here in Ontario earlier this week. The PM and the Premier were talking about a joint investment to cut 13% of the HST that's applied on new homes. And as part of this deal, Ontario would agree to cut developer charges in half, as well as getting access to some infrastructure funding. Erin, you know the provincial lay of the land better than I do. Obviously, Ontario's housing starts are in the toilet. It was an issue that the former Prime Minister was carrying water for. How big is this for just Carney or for Ford's future? Or maybe if it's more of important for Ford than Carney, like how big of an issue has been the housing, even though it felt like in the last election it got overshadowed with everything happening stateside?
Yeah, I think it's a bigger issue for Ford than for Carney. What Canadians expect of Carney right now is the big picture: sovereignty, trade, our security, and the coast to coast to coast economy. And I think Canadians are actually pretty savvy in terms of understanding what the federal government's responsible for, what the provinces are responsible for. And they really do not hold the federal government responsible for healthcare and housing. They really do put that onto premiers and to some extent, municipal governments as well. And Doug Ford's record on housing is just a clown show, just horrible. Housing starts absolutely in the toilet. Housing prices continue to be up. And in that press conference, he walked away from the previously stated goal of 1.5 million homes, which he's not anywhere even close to achieving anyway. But it was like, that's no longer our priority. Like, we just gave it a little bit of a thought and decided, not homes for everybody. You don't all need a place to live. Not really my problem. I have a place to live. I don't know what's wrong with you, right? And for the generation, like, I'm thinking like, sort of 40 and under right now. Ontario is just such a scary place to try to build a life. I mean, rents are still very high. People are still living with roommates in their 30s and putting off actual real life decisions, putting off having a kid because they can't afford a second bedroom, putting off getting married because they're still in a roommate situation. And forget buying a house, right? Buying a house feels out of reach for so many people. And that also means that, this generation is going to have a harder time retiring than their parents did. So this is not not my priority right now. I'm really focused on something else. I don't think Doug Ford can get away with that because it's existential for hundreds of thousands of people in this province.
Brian, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Do you think, because Erin's talking about, obviously everyone knows that the housing affordability crisis is real. I think only BC BC would be the only contender to Ontario's title of worst housing market in the country. But the fact that he cut the HST as opposed to maybe some other measures he could have done, like some of the zoning changes that have been discussed and bandied about. Do you think that was a smart move for him? Because it's something that when you go to buy a house, you feel tangibly, even though maybe it would have the same effect of accelerating home construction like some other measures would. Like, do you think that was a smart political play by the premier?
Leaving the politics out of it for now, Marco, is it going to work? Like, every indicator showed that housing prices were going to be dropping this year, and next year already had started dropping. I think the devil's in the details. Like, if this goes and they cut the DC charges in half in municipalities, it's going to have a real substantive impact on twofold. One, for the time period in which the government is deciding to do this, like I was talking to the mayor of Barrie, in his community, it could reduce the price of a $700,000 house by $130,000. That's a very temporary measure, but it's a very real measure. It's also going to decrease the price of the house that people are trying to sell by a similar portion, right? So anytime you try to play with the market in a situation where there's massive instability, I think it's dangerous. But certainly this is going to be an opportunity for young people to get into houses, and the developers are very happy because their very dried up market will see an influx for sure when you inject this much money into the system. I agree. Walking away from first of all, I never thought the 1.5 million. It was like the billion trees comment. Like, I didn't see how it was ever going to be a thing the government was going to do. And you are starting to see that, Marco always calls him the Teflon premier. Like, things are starting to stick when it comes to some of these things. Like, we are in an international crisis that is affecting our economy, whether it's the US tariffs, whether it's now the war in Iran. There are some really serious things going on in the world. I personally think it was Erin mentioned it, like, lots of times I think Mark Carney gets a pass, whether he actually succeeds on something or not, because he looks like the right person for the job. He looks serious. And I think that's where the premier is falling down the last several times, is there's a lack of seriousness to the approach on some of these things. And even for a conservative, there's a real lack of like understanding the direction and plan that you're like, what is the plan? We just decided to drop $8 billion into the housing market. And what is the plan for that? And how is that going to affect seniors who have spent their entire life planning on that home being part of their nest egg in retirement in the next couple of years? There's more questions than there is answers. And I think that's always a really risky place for a government to put themselves.
What do you think about that, Jonathan? Brian brings up a good point. Like, maybe some of the attributes that made Ford so popular sort of hurt him against. If he's not seen, being, friendly, salt of the earth type premier may work against him if he seems like maybe you're out of your depth here and you don't know how to fix these problems. Do you think that could be a risk to the premier?
Well, eventually people want results. On housing, it's always been the issue that probably is the hardest to come up with a policy, or really a suite of policies that you're going to benefit from politically, because they just can't be implemented overnight. And so you try to figure out, is there a quick fix that in the short term I can at least look like I'm doing something? And then will that actually then lead to other things? So on this specific policy on the HST, like, it's one of many different measures. So the federal government, where 3 years ago, 4 years ago, were saying, well, this is really more a provincial and a municipal issue. Now they're really saying, okay, we get it. Here's a whole bunch of things that we're going to do, but do you feel it? Do I feel it? Is this going to start? So this measure probably could have more immediate impacts than some of the others. It's not about building a house or building a condo tower that will take 5 years. This will affect the pocketbook and the ability of people to actually buy. Now, there's the consequence on the seller. Yes, Gregor Robertson got into trouble on that on the first day as minister. So that's always a balancing act. But this is the issue where people want to see results and where results are always the furthest away. Yeah. So for Doug Ford, who's been there for a long time and where he's been this Teflon guy, at some point people will say, okay, but how is it impacting my day-to-day life? That's why I think you're seeing some movement. Is it enough? I doubt it.
I'm curious, and I don't want to throw you under the gun here, but I'm curious just to get your thoughts, because I get what Jonathan's saying, Brian, and Erin's point. It's like, but how do you measure success? Because yeah, Jonathan's right. Gregor walked into the firing squad by saying like prices, high or low. I know it's an overly simplistic question, but I think it's also a tough one. Like rent, and I've seen the Liberals pivot on this, being like, look, guys, rents are down, home prices are down. It's like, yeah, they're down because our economy is kind of tanking, and the number of people coming to this sharply reduced. So like, what is a good solution? Because if I'm my mortgage, I overpaid during the pandemic, I'm like, what do I do? What's a good solution?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Erin kind of painted a good portrait there of what it's like to be a young person in your 30s thinking about whether you're ever going to own a home. And I know, Marco, you and I talk about this all the time. And announcements like the one that we saw this week, I wonder, is it going to make me more likely to be able to afford a home? And I know that there's some kind of trickle down economics argument at play where, we build new homes and then, wealthier people move into those homes, and then, people buying their first home can move into that home. Because obviously it's not, young people in their 30s coming out of education with debt that are going to be building new homes, right? You're going to start off with a starter home that's like kind of at the lower end of the spectrum there. So this trickle down economics, I don't know if it translates well in terms of like results and outcome of how we feel. You could kind of see that with Doug Ford in the first few years when he was following all these targets. He had to kind of do some creative accounting at some point and say that long-term care beds count as homes because otherwise, the numbers were too low. But tell that to a young person that a long-term care bed counts as a home. Because it's like, again, the idea is that, you'll move into whoever moved into that bed, but I think the math of how that happens isn't quite clear and clear cut, if I could say.
Yeah, no, that's fair. We're rapidly running out of time here, but I would like everyone to get an opportunity to kind of share their thoughts. So at the end of every episode, ask our guests, their thoughts on maybe an issue that they were following last week or something they're looking forward to the week ahead. I'll start with you, Erin. What's your final thoughts to our viewers?
I think as a New Democrat, as the lefty here, I think my final thought for the week is that parties need to keep their own side of the streets clean. They need to figure out how to get along with each other before they can figure out how to lead Canadians. And I think that is true when we're talking about CAQ. I think that's true when we're talking about Quebec Solidaire. I think it's true when we're talking about the Conservatives right now. It is a hard time in Canada to keep your coalition together. So that's really on my mind this week.
Aya, what about you?
Ottawa wanted to strike these cooperation agreements with all the provinces for project assessment, and they've done a good job at it. Only 3 provinces left to sign on: Quebec, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. And I asked the provinces what's the hold up, and I heard that something to do with carbon pricing, which is unrelated to project assessment. So we'll be following more on that.
Yeah, it should be something to keep our eyes on. What about you, Jonathan?
Well, in April, it's 6 months till the election in Quebec. And so I'm looking at everything that's going to be used by the PQ, who have squandered their lead and are now tied with the Liberals in the polls. They're still ahead seat-wise because of the way the polls distribute it and the concentration of votes in Montreal for the Liberals. But what will happen on the Bill 21 hearing? Will there actually be a decision before the election? I hope not. Although I suspect that the decision will probably uphold the notwithstanding clause and keep that bill constitutional. So that might help the Liberals, but let's see. But whether it's Don Cherry or Michael Russo or whatever tomorrow's issue will be, and there will be more issues, what will be next? That's what I'm following. That will be used by Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon and the Separatists to try to figure out how to motivate their voting base.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of runway before the election. Brian, what about you?
Well, I'm going to stick in Ontario. Minister Calandra was out yesterday in Queen's Park briefing saying that legislation was coming imminently, and there was going to be big changes with nearly 50% of Ontario students failing the standardized math tests at grades 6 and 9. I would say there definitely needs to be some changes to the system. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the minister brings forward and if they're substantive or if it's more just about school boards.
No, I think that's a good point. Something that Barbara down Queen 3 or 3 for 3. I don't want to understate it because we cover in our live blog and I want to pump up our viewers, our readers there. But if not, the polls still show the Liberals are riding high. I don't think the Prime Minister is feeling any threat from the opposition parties in terms of selling on his agenda. So whatever he decides to do, I don't know if he necessarily is boxing himself in the corner by saying probation, not right now. But I will, of course, follow that and see what the future holds for that discussion. But Jonathan, Erin, Aya, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Same time next week, folks. Have a great one.